Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you, Jean. It's a real pleasure to be with you here this morning. You know, in such a beautiful venue as this, silence usually sends the crowd away. But this morning, it's brought a crowd. And I thank you for that. Silence. Where do you start with silence? Where do you start? Maybe with a confession? Sure. I Googled it. Of course I Googled it. You know, you would too. And let's be honest, there's lots of stuff out there on silence. There's tons of material. And so I clicked and I thought, I'm going to find just the right thing that's going to spark this talk. And I kept going, and I'm like, that's good. And then after a while, it got to be really overwhelming. And I realized that I was kind of addicted to this, the answers out there. And then I realized, what I'm doing here is really just adding to the noise. So I decided to do something radical. I said, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to stop clicking. And I'm just going to get quiet. I'm going to get silent. And I'm just going to wait for something to bubble up, right? So I sat in a chair, decided not to think about anything, just to sit there and wait. And things started to come up. But what I really like doing is taking walks. So I took a walk, which is normally what I do when I've got all this stuff going around, just to get quiet. So slowly, some things started coming together. It's a lot how I compose music, actually. So when I compose music, I try to be really still and quiet. I just sort of let my hands run over my guitar. And eventually, I get to something, and my whole body goes, yes! And I'm like, that's great. I set it aside. I keep working on something else until I get to another, yes! And then I connect the yes with the yes. And then the other yes, and eventually you have a song. Well, it's kind of the same thing when you put a talk together. So I started getting some yeses, right, when I was in the silence. So today's talk is really my yes to yes to yes ideas that came together. So here's how I think of silence. I think of silence in three different ways. 1, silence as a concept or a metaphor. 2, silence as in the space between, as a tool for more impactful expression. And 3, grand, spacious, eternal soundlessness or unmanipulated sound at the heart of nature and the cosmos, a sphere of order, beauty, and spirituality. Let's start with the first one, silence as a concept or metaphor. In our culture, we use silence a lot as just a metaphor. Let me give you an example. The famous song, Sound of Silence, right? Simon and Garfunkel. Hello, darkness, my old friend, right? Okay, everybody kind of knows that song. It's sort of in our fiber. But what is that song really about? Is it really about silence? No, not so much. It's really about loneliness. That's the metaphor for loneliness and disconnection, right? That we're all busy, there's all these people, and yet nobody's connecting. So it's a metaphor for the disconnection. We use it a lot in that way. Another song, this time of year we think of Silent Night, right? Okay, so Silent Night. What do we think of when we think of the song Silent Night? It's really a metaphor for simplicity and beauty and the miraculous. Right? A light in a dark place. It's another way we think of silence. It's a metaphor. Now, silence as a concept. Now, imagine this. It's the summer of 1952, and it's a warm August night, and you're inside this small concert hall. It's all made of wood. It's in the woods, actually. It's a few miles away from Woodstock, New York. And it's a special evening. because tonight's concert is going to feature new music by some of classical music's most respected avant-garde and experimental composers, including Milton, John Cage, and a few others. Morton Feldman. That's what I was trying to say. So in the audience, there's a bunch of people who were sort of excited about this because these are some bigwigs in the avant-garde music scene. There's some musicians from the New York Philharmonic who are there in attendance. They want to see what these renegade composers are up to. Okay, there's some locals there. There's some classical music fans. Now imagine the scene. You're in the woods. This is a funky little place. Okay, there's actually an oak tree growing through the roof of this venue. It's all wood. It's kind of creaky. Can you imagine what it's like in this summer of August? You probably got insects and crickets, probably a distant dog barking, probably got squirrels scurrying around. So you're inside this venue. You look around. There's kind of this buzz. The concert goes on. There's some music. About halfway through this concert is a premiere of one of John Cage's new works. Now, he's in the audience. He's not performing. His friend, David Tudor, who's the pianist, is going to perform this next piece. He's dressed in a tux. He comes out to the front of the stage. There's a grand piano here. He shuts the piano lid. He takes his sheet of music, puts it on the piano. He starts a stopwatch. He puts it down next to him. He sits down, and he starts to play. He raises his hands as though he's pantomiming something, and he just sits there. And a little while later, he sort of shifts his hands again. No sound, nothing. He does this a couple more times until at 4 minutes and 33 seconds, he gets up, stops the stopwatch, and walks off the stage. So the people are in the audience are like, what? What was that? They were pissed. They were. They're thinking, are we stupid? Like, are you calling that music? Like what's going on? So there was an uproar. One of the locals actually stood up and said, let's run these people out of town. Seriously, it happened. So what did happen? He really wasn't trying to write a piece of music, obviously. It was a concept, right? Sure, he set them up with all the atmospherics. They were ready for this thing to happen. And then he surprised them and said, no music. So what did he do? He really was saying, hey, you don't have to play an instrument in this formal setting that we're normally used to be a concert, to be music. He was letting the space in those 4 minutes and 33 seconds actually resonate with the sounds around them. Nature was coming through. People rustling in their seats, probably murmuring, what the hell is this? Right? That was the real music. He was trying to show people that you don't have to have this traditional setting, that there's another whole sphere of this music. Even the reaction afterwards was kind of part of his piece. So what he did was he surprised people. He subtracted what they normally were expecting. Okay? And what did people do? They put their feelings into that space, their expectations. They were mad. But he removed that. That was part of the whole experience. Their reaction to it was part of his concept. Well, it didn't go over very well. And actually, he was blacklisted. His other composer friends wouldn't work with him. They thought he had committed career suicide. Really, it's true. However, there were some musicians who were coming up in the next generation who were incredibly inspired by this piece. Steve Reich, for example. Even Pete Townsend of The Who wrote this piece for the sea, the ocean, as part of one of his rock medleys. And Brian Eno, very well-known British composer writing ambient music and electronic music, said he became a musician because of John Cage and his piece about silence. So it's very powerful, which gets me to another point. Quite often, silence has to do with subtraction, which can lead to innovation. Subtracted what we expected, came to something brand new. And people didn't even know how impactful it was really until later. Now, which gets me to the second concept, which is silence as the space between. Now, I'd like all of us to just get quiet for a second, okay? We're just going to pause, enjoy the silence. Okay. How long do you think that was? Anybody? Anybody? 12, 20, 10? All right, you guys are... You're not setting me up very well with this one. You were ready for it. 2 minutes, there, thank you. It was 2 minutes. I don't really know because I didn't set my stopwatch. It doesn't matter anyway. It turns out, however, that in a typical social conversation in America, it takes about 4 seconds for people to start to squirm when there's silence, right? You know the feeling. You're talking to somebody and then there's this pause and you're like, oh my gosh, I got to say something. I got to jump in there. I'm really uncomfortable, and probably something like, it's going to look like I'm dumb if I don't have something to say. Or maybe I'm feeling bad. They don't have something to say. So I'm going to jump in and say, how about those cards? Or something, right? Right? We all do this. But really, that's really about us and our discomfort with silence and with space. Now, there's some great research on this. When an interviewer talks to somebody who's being interviewed, okay, they've done some research where the interviewer is told to interrupt the person who's talking, right? They're telling their story, they're reciting something. The interviewer comes in and says, yes, okay, nice, tell me more, or that sounds good. Yeah, I've had that same experience. What happens is that shuts down the person who's talking. Even if it's a positive, like, yeah, even if that gets this person out of their flow. So they did research where they told the interviewer really to say nothing. Just let the person talk. It turns out when the person just talked without any sort of interruption, that person's flow actually produced more meaningful information than anything else. Just being silent with somebody. So think about this time of year. Everybody's thinking about giving gifts to people for the holidays. What we can do is maybe give somebody the gift and the respect to just let them be and talk without having to say or think anything, right? Not about me, not about my discomfort. Just going to let someone else talk. So we can think of silence as a gift. Silence as a gift. Here's another example. My friend Julia Flood, who's actually here in attendance. Hi, Julia. She is the artistic director of Metro Theater Company. And a wonderful one at that, I will say. So I was telling her what I was doing with this talk. And she had this comment. She says, I tell my actors that they have to earn their pause. I said, that's great. Tell me more. What do you mean about earning their pause? And first she gave the example of the famous playwright Harold Pinter. She said, well, in a Harold Pinter script, he actually writes in places where it says pause. And she says, in those moments in the play where there's a pause, she said, that's where the most meaning happens. So she said, and it doesn't work unless what comes before the pause has a certain clarity and power and intention to it. That's what carries over into the space so that people can absorb what just came before it. It gives time for people to have a reaction to it. That's what she meant by earning the pause. Am I right? Did I get you right? So when she's working with actors, she makes sure that whatever they deliver before that has to have that sort of intention and that power so they can earn that pause. I thought that was great. Thank you so much for that, by the way. So here's another example. In the late 1950s, jazz had been around the block for a while. Now, bebop had been sort of the main pillar of jazz. Bebop is jazz that's typically rather fast with lots of chord changes. And soloists have to play notes that fit those different chords. And it's very difficult, very complicated. The early inventors of bebop were Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and Miles Davis and others. It was an incredible art form, and you had to be really virtuosic to play this style of music. It was kind of like similar to what was going on in the art world in the 50s with abstract expressionism. You know, a lot of people did not get bebop. They were like, what is this music? It's just too much for them. It was too many notes. Now, jazz had gone through a couple other evolutions. There was cool jazz, and that was on the West Coast. And then there was hard bop, that was sort of a return to bebop with this harder groove going on. But in the late 1950s, Miles Davis decided he wanted to try something else. He wanted to slow things down. He had this concept for a new style of music. So he hired some pretty good musicians, John Coltrane, Cannonball Adderley, Bill Evans, among others, and brought them into the studio. He had some music sketched out, and he told them his idea. I want to slow this down. He did not let them practice the music. They did not see it. Because he wanted to slow down their thinking when he put it on the stand. He wanted to record them essentially practicing. He wanted the real deal. He wanted it to be live and in the moment. So, they start to record this album, and they did it all in basically one take. Right? So, what happens? The album, what was he thinking? So instead of long chords moving quickly, he said, you know, let's do one chord for a long time. And I don't want you to think about what chord change do I have to play. That's too much thinking. I want you just to take one scale or one mode and just play in that mode for a while. Just open it up. Let it breathe. And then maybe we'll change to another chord. And then we'll do that. So he slowed it down. He opened up the texture, became very moody and emotional. And what was he really doing? He was increasing the space between the notes. The space between, that was where the magic was. It created this sense of intimacy. It gave people time to react, really take in this mood. It was incredibly popular. It became the best-selling jazz album of all time. So I'm going to listen a little bit to this piece. This is from the album Kinda Blue, which was the famous recording, and this is from the song So What? And I want you to listen for how much space he leaves. You'll hear a little bit of his solo, and he gives a little phrase and he stops. And you'll see how much space there is between those notes and how powerful it is. Could you hear it? Hear the space? So this album was very innovative. It started a whole new subgenre in jazz called Modal Jazz. So here's another example of subtraction leading to innovation. Now, I'm going to give you one more example. You're probably wondering, when is he going to pick up that guitar? This is the moment where I pick up the guitar. which seems kind of strange, right? How do you talk about silence with a guitar? Well, you could talk about the space between, which is kind of what I'm going to do. But first I'm going to say this, that in music there's a term we call rubato, which comes from the Italian word rubare, which means to steal. So sometimes in a piece of music, you'll get to a section where it says rubato. And what's happening here essentially is that we're stealing a moment away from the usual tempo of the song and saying, time out, forget about that tempo now. We're going to be in a section where it's rubato, which means somebody's playing a melody and they're taking their sweet time with it. Okay? Take as much time as you want. We're just going to wait. Make it expressive, make it musical, and then let us know, and we'll go back into the rest of our song, the regular tempo. I love rubato. I love this idea of rubato. So what I'm going to do, and by the way, you can have a whole song that's rubato. It doesn't have to just be in a section, which is the song I'm going to play. So this is an original piece. It's about 2 minutes long. And it's rubato. Okay, so you'll hear a melody, and you'll hear some chords underneath it. It's super slow. Okay, it's not in time. And I want you to take a moment just to enjoy the space of this piece. You'll notice that there's a lot of space in between the notes, the space in between. And try to listen for the music that is not the music that's just the space behind the notes. Okay? Here we go. And there's no name for this. This is still new, to be entitled later. Thank you. That gets us to our last point. Silence as a grand, spacious, eternal soundlessness or unmanipulated sound at the heart of nature and the cosmos, a sphere of order, beauty, and spirituality. I don't know about you, but I usually think of nature when I think about this. These are a few places I went this summer on vacation, by the way. That's the Catskills in New York. I Googled that one. There's not much to say, really. That's the whole point. When there's such beauty, silence kind of says it all. Quite often our faiths and religions teach us to yield ourselves to this greater other, that we may be transformed. Now, the writer Aldous Huxley, who was really not religious at all, described this concept perfectly in a talk he gave in 1955 entitled, "Who Are We?" He said, "I think we have to prepare the mind in one way or another to accept the great uprush or downrush, whichever you like to call it, of the greater non-self." Don't you love that? The greater non-self. It's sort of this concept that there's us and then there's not us, but that there is this other greater non-self, in whatever term you like to call it, and that there's great power and beauty in that space. We think about meditating, we think about prayer, we think about getting clear, we think about breathing, trying to tap into that space. There's a great quote by a writer, theologian, and philosopher, Richard Rohr, which I'm going to read. He says, "You do not hear silence, but it is that by which you do hear. You cannot capture silence, it captures you. Silence is a kind of thinking that is not thinking. It's a kind of thinking which mostly sees through contemplation. Silence, then, is an alternative consciousness. It is a form of intelligence, a form of knowing beyond bodily reacting or emotion. It is a form of knowing beyond mental analysis, which is what we usually call thinking. All of the great world religions at the higher mystical levels discovered that our tyrannical mode of everyday thinking, which is largely compulsive, brain-driven, and based on early patterning and conditioning, has to be relativized and limited, or it takes over, to the loss of our primal being and identity in ourselves." Quite often at the end of speeches, there's a call to action. But I'm going to do the opposite today. I'm going to call you and me and all of us to inaction. I'm going to try this for a little bit each day, maybe more than one day, to rob the tempo which normally drives you to a timeout. So, in whatever place works, whether it's your upstairs room, whether it's a trail, or whether it's just any place, you can just shut your eyes. And I hope that you give yourselves and others the intentional gift of silence. And as you breathe gently, as your breath rises and falls, I hope that you'll gain a new sense of lightness and alertness, and a sense of wonder and gratitude and possibility, that it may illuminate that inner silence. Thank you. Thank you.